Hello, hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well. So awesome to have you here on Talk Python and talking academics. I didn't tell you before we hit record, but I spent a long time at universities and I just love them. They're such cool places, and it's going to be really fun to get a look inside how Python's being used there.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And yes, I too love universities. It's kind of like all the coolest parts of humanity just kind of intermixing in one place. So yeah, I'd love to kind of peel back the curtain on how.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about how, we're going to talk about how you and your colleagues use Python and data science inside of your neurology research lab. But before we dive into that, let's just get a bit of background on yourself. Who are you? How do you get into Python? All those things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Keelan Cooper. I'm a neuroscientist at the University of California, Irvine, so Southern California, about 15 minutes from the beach and an hour from the mountains. But I'm originally from the middle of nowhere, Indiana. And I started playing with computers and code when I was young, so like middle school-ish, just ripping apart computers and seeing what was in them and then trying to put them back together and feeling bad when they didn't work right after. And then the typical, tweaking the software when you don't like what it does until you make it work. And then probably my senior year of high school is when I started teaching myself Python. And it was because we had to do for some government class, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And we had to learn, we were learning about the stock market. And every day you'd have to spend like 15 minutes going to like some stock website and like filling out your fake stocks. And so I wrote a really small Python script that would just pull the data from the website and populate like an Excel spreadsheet. And so every day the kids in the class were just like going through and like spending 15, 20 minutes by hand writing it down. And I would just sit there and
that's awesome.
Wait. And so that was kind of the first time I was like, wow, this whole automation thing is pretty sweet. And then from there, Python just I caught the bug pretty early. Python was definitely the way to go.
Yeah. Was Python your first programming language?
I mean, first programming language was the Windows registry and trying to undo all of the mistakes of the operating system. But it was my first.
It's been a while. Yeah. It's been a while since I've been in the Windows registry, but good old regedit.
Yeah, I switched to Linux pretty quick. And yeah.
Are you still on Linux?
Mostly. My desktops are all Linux. My servers are obviously all Linux. I like Mac for a laptop just because, Linux has this thing where you tinker with it. And so then any small task you want to do, you end up like rewriting some deep script in the operating system. And like 2 hours later, you're like, what was that small thing I was trying to do again?
Yeah, exactly. I got distracted. I was rewriting something in there and off we go. Yeah.
Yeah. So Macs are nice because you still have all the same Unix-like properties that are great, but you pay a price for reliability, but it's pretty
yeah. You just sell a bit of your soul out, but boy, is that UI nice, and those little menu bar apps are handy. I was that's right. I was been playing with running Ubuntu on my Mac M2 Pro, which it runs great, but it's an ARM version of Mac of Linux rather. Well, both really, but boy, is there a limited supply of applications for an ARM Linux distribution. Let me tell you. They're like, just download the Debian package. Yeah, they're like, just download the Debian package. You just install it. Like, wrong platform. Like, again? Over half. But yeah, I think it will change as I think ARM's going to start to take over Windows a little bit as well. And obviously the Mac world is basically transitioning. So
and
anyone who has a Mac, I
think it's Qualcomm that just kind of started hinting that they were going to try and really heavily compete with the M line of processors and have some pretty good specs. So
yeah,
it'll be good. I have an M3. It's pretty nice.
It is really nice. And like I said, I like to run more stuff on it, but it's still kind of Intel or x86 stuff for Linux and Windows. So it's a little hard to work with that, but still super fun. that's a long way to say it's a very long
Oh,
time
yeah.
since I've been in Regedit. Personally, it sounds like you as well, being not naming Windows too much.
Yeah. No, I'm so bad at Windows now. Like when I'm helping people with Python or something else and they show me their computer, there's always that like 10-minute learning curve of like, okay, how do I do anything basic on this machine? Or even like the keyboard shortcuts you get so accustomed to when people don't have any of those little things that you're just like, how do I
honestly
select
that's it.
Everything?
Yes, that is it. Like I did professional software development on Windows for a long time. I even wrote a bunch of Windows apps. It was great. But going back and forth too quickly, or Linux, like just the hotkeys, I just get broken. Not just on Windows, also when I come back to Mac, like I'm just completely out of sorts. So yeah, it's fun. All right, well, let's talk academics and Python from a probably a OS, mostly agnostic perspective. But yeah, just, give us a sense of the kind of research you do, what is your field? What do you study? Those kinds of things. So people get a sense of like,
why am I talking about
where you're coming from as you talk about doing all these things.
Yeah. So the core of my work is pure neuroscience. So basic science. What we do mainly in the lab is we take really tiny wires, so they're like a fifth of the size of the human hair, and now we're using something called silicon probes, they're manufactured the same way that computer chips are manufactured on silicon wafers using photolithography. And so you
get a higher
really
density that way. Do you get like a bunch of little sensors on one attachment point or something? Okay.
So we used to build these little drives. I used to have one here, but I got rid of it. Little drives by hand. So you would just feed these wires in with forceps. And so you'd get maybe 64 or 128 at most, depending on how much time you want to sit there and feed the wires in. But now you can just get them manufactured. You pay a lot more, but you get twice, 3 times the sites. And the whole point is the more sites you have, the more neurons you can actually record from in the brain.
So you're not just saying this part of the brain lit up, but you can have a much better picture,
so
right?
The constituent part of your brain is the neuron. And so of the millions and billions of neurons, depending on the species you're recording from, we can record maybe a few hundred of them. But that's usually sufficient to actually, in the specific region you study, and I can talk about that a bit more, to discern some sort of information from it. So really the data type we really care about is this tiny little electrical voltages that tell you what different neurons in the brain are talking about. And so you put the wires in, you record the conversations of a bunch of neurons. And particularly we're interested in 2 brain regions that are critical for memory, learning, and decision making. And this is the hippocampus, which in humans is about the size of your pinky and a few inches in from your ear, and the prefrontal cortex, which most people know about, right behind your forehead, important for learning, decision making, and all those sorts of things. So that's the core of my work is I'm in the lab doing the actual data collection and building equipment to actually do that. But once you have all of that data and the data keeps growing, like most other fields, you got to do a lot of pre-processing, which takes Python. You got to do a lot of post-processing, which takes a lot of Python. And also we do something called neural decoding. So not only do we just like say descriptively what are these neurons doing, but we can go one step further and say what actual information are these cells representing. And so in the brain we can kind of say this is kind of the fundamental kind of information transfer and how information is manipulated in the brain and how it ships information from the environment into memory and how it uses that to make a decision. All of those kinds of things we can use through fancy modeling and statistics and more recently deep learning and those sorts of things.
Yeah. We'll have to come back to deep learning later. That'll be fun.
Yeah.
Well, given your background. So for this hardware, do you write the software that actually talks directly to the hardware, or is there something that just records it and you grab some sort of custom file format and run with it?
Yeah, more recently, it kind of depends on the lab. So as time goes on, there's more and more companies that you can just buy off the shelf kind of recording platforms, mostly for the uh, electrical engineering people. It's kind of like an audio like amplifier because you're recording at millivolts in the brain. So you have to amplify it, write it to, if you're plugged in with a wire, write it to the computer. So all that takes software in various forms. And then we do a lot of animal research. So the tasks that the animals do are pretty much all automated. But recently in the lab, we've kind of had this resurgence of like developing kind of novel hardware and a lot of automation of behavior. So I've kind of rewritten most of our entire behavioral stack, which is a lot of just so microcontroller programming, which not a lot of that's in Python. A lot of that's just kind of like C++ and those sorts of things. But we have cameras all over. So I wrote this kind of like camera server that streams all of the camera footage from a bunch of automated boxes to some like central server that just collects all of that data. So yeah, a lot of the behavioral stuff nowadays we're just building in house to collect all of the behavior data. And the EFIS stuff is now, especially because we're doing something called wireless recording. So instead of just having a wire plugged into the head, it just writes it to like an SD card or Bluetooth. That's just kind of all on chip.
Yeah.
And so it's just whatever the microcontroller language of the chip needs.
That's wild. I think it's surprising how much software and even hardware, but definitely software is involved for something that doesn't sound like a software discipline, right?
Yeah.
You know, you wouldn't think of what you guys are doing as inherently almost like a software team, but there's a lot of software there.
Absolutely. And it's growing. So it used to be like 10, 20 years ago, more biology, I'd say, like more wet lab stuff. But 90% of what I do as kind of a neurobiologist is really just engineering style things. Like I'm more recently designing PCBs, and I'm in the shop a lot, just like with saws and hammers and drills, and like actually physically building things, and obviously a lot of code. And the coding part is becoming bigger and bigger to the point where in the field, I always say that the neuroscience is like about 3 decades behind astrophysics. Because all the problems that like neuroscientists like say we're facing now as a field, they had like 3 decades prior. Where in astrophysics, they're like, well, or in neuroscience, we're like, what do we do with all this data? This just I'm collecting 100 gigabytes an hour, if not more. Like, what do we do?
That is a lot.
Yeah, but relative to like some of those big telescopes that are collecting like almost petabyte scale.
Yeah. I would say both ends of physics, like the very, very extreme ends of physics. So astrophysics, the very large, and then particle physics, right? At CERN as well. They've got insane amounts of data. Yeah.
And that's what we're starting to see, I think, in neuroscience too, is that kind of division of like, because the scale of data collection is so big, you're starting to need not just a single lab, but teams. So we have a few institutes now that are just pumping out terabytes of data. And so you start to see that division between the neuroscientists who are really in the lab, hands-on with actual neural tissue or the recording device, and the neuroscientists who are just take the data and analyze it and develop new models and statistical models. And also theory, there's always a dearth of theory in neuroscience, but the computational modeling is certainly getting a lot bigger within the last few decades as well, where people's entire job is just how do we model some of these things in code.
Well, do you see, you probably run into different research groups, different teams that have different levels of sophistication from a software side? And do you see like a productivity or a quality difference jump out from like the kind of work or the velocity of work that people are doing there?
Absolutely. And it makes me almost like so a lot of, it's a huge range. There are like very sophisticated labs, and usually those are the labs that have kind of just a pure software person on the team. or people who are very inclined towards software, all the way to, and it makes me so sad when people are spending like weeks in a spreadsheet just manually doing things by hand.
Yeah, I know.
Like, you could do this in 5 minutes in Python, or like pandas, you could just load it and take it.
And it, not only could you do it faster, you could do it without any errors.
Yeah, more reliable.
Right. You none of those like, oh, I misread it and I shifted off by a cell, or I typed in, missed something, right? Because the code just reads what's there. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that a lot of like graduate programs are starting to wake up to this fact that it's going to be almost impossible to do any science without some degree of proficiency in coding. And I think a lot of say grad students and postdocs and so on, when they actually sit down and try and analyze their data, whether they're just in Excel or they need to write a little Python script, that's kind of their first introduction is, oh, I have this data, I need to do something with it. I'm going to Google exactly how do I read in this data, or how do I do a t-test in Python, or how do I plot something in Matplotlib. And that's kind of the level that they start getting into out of necessity. But the sophistication and the speed, because they're usually just teaching themselves. That's most of academia. It's just, you have a problem, spend a few days Googling and reading books until you find it.
And once it works, you can kind of just leave it. You don't have to clean it up or anything, right? Yeah. Okay.
Which results in a lot of, science, the progress of science doesn't go away, but the code is, not robust. And so that's why you see things, especially in other fields of like psychology and such, of like replication crises, and people have done meta-analysis of running the same software stack on like 12 different data sets and you get different results. And so you start to kind of see that, that shaky foundation is starting to bleed into the, like you said, the reliability.
It's starting to have consequences, not just it's more work or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, maybe we could start a bit by just talking about maybe the history, diving into this a little bit more, just the history of programming in neuroscience. I wasn't in neuroscience in any way, but I worked with a bunch of cognitive scientists studying, how people solve problems and thought about things at a lab for one of my first jobs. And we studied all through eye tracking. Yeah. Like not the letter I, not the iPhone, but actual eyes. And it was fascinating. It was tons of data. It was really cool. And there were, like you described, a lot of people who would do sort of Excel stuff, and they would take the data and they'd process it. And over time, we just started to automate these things. And their first thought was, you're programming me out of a job. I'm like, no. This is the crappy part of your job. Like, you're supposed to analyze the results and think about it and plan new stuff. And like, now you can just focus on that. Right. And as the software got better, we just tackled bigger problems. So, maybe give us a bit of a history on your side.
Yeah. So I love the cognitive science part. That's my more background is cognitive science. That's my undergrad, and grew up in science in a cognitive science department while also doing some wet lab neuroscience stuff. So it's
did
fun.
You start? Yeah, absolutely. Did you start out with like MATLAB and that kind of stuff? Is that where they told you need to be?
Exactly. Yeah. So a lot of so neuroscience has certainly had at least our branch of neuroscience, just because by the nature of recording voltages, and you need to write to a computer. So there has been kind of a long history of, for as long as there's been even like punch card computers, people have kind of read in the data into the computer and done, their statistics on that rather than something else. I'm actually recently writing a kind of a review article on kind of the history of data science and neuroscience. And I loved this paper. It was from 1938, and they took an EEG spectrum, and so EEG is just the continuous time series of brain voltage. So you're not in the brain recording, and this is, I think, from humans. And they took something called the Fourier transform, which for those that might not be as up to speed with that is you basically just take some oscillating signal and you break it down into its constituent parts. And most of you have seen it before if you've ever seen like an audio spectrogram. That's kind of the most notable visualization where you can kind of see the high frequencies and the
basically it pulls the frequencies out of the signal, right?
Yeah. But the way they did this, now this is 1938, there's no computers. So they actually had a mechanical device where they would just take this EEG trace that was on tape and they would feed it into this like mechanical machine. And it would basically read kind of this black line on the tape. And so as it would crank the tape around this machine, depending on kind of the frequency that the line went up and down, that would read out the Fourier transform. So it was mechanical.
Wow.
Like a lot of those cool devices back in the older days.
Yeah, that's impressive.
Now you can get that same thing in MATLAB. You just type FFT, parentheses, put your data in the middle, and you get the same thing in microseconds. But neuroscience, at least my field, has kind of always had this kind of serendipitous relationship with computing generally, coding generally. And a lot of the code, I think, earlier on was Fortran-ish, and then it moved towards MATLAB, and MATLAB's kind of had its stake in the ground for a long time. Just because that was the first kind of software that you could really do array manipulations on well, and it was kind of a higher level than some of the lower level programming.
Yeah.
So a lot of the older labs have, their entire code base and stack and analysis software in MATLAB. And so it's only been within maybe 5 to 6, 7 years, probably a bit longer, 10 years, that you've really seen Python start to supplant MATLAB as kind of the de facto programming language in labs, just because of the cost of trying to transfer everything over. And despite the fact that MATLAB isn't open source and it's extremely expensive, most universities have licenses, and so that kind of facilitates.
It's prepaid.
Yeah,
in a sense, but it is
but it's still pretty expensive.
Especially if you get those little toolboxes like wavelet decomposition toolbox, $2,000 instead of a pip install.
Yeah. And again, we do a lot of signal processing, and so that's exactly the place you want to be. And like MATLAB usually controls, because it has pretty good control over like external hardware. You can run like your behavior, your task kind of in MATLAB code. So you can kind of do everything in one language as you would like to do in Python. But it's starting to kind of go away. And I think a lot of that is just because the allure of Python with just so many tools, and because it's probably a lot easier to learn for most people than MATLAB, we're kind of starting to see that switch now that there's kind of more to offer, I'd say, a lot of scientists than MATLAB.
Yeah, you said 10, 12 years ago. Yeah, the difference in the external packages on PyPI you can get, and especially the ones for data science, have just exploded. The choices and the stuff that's out there is it's pretty diverse and it's pretty crazy.
The only other one that I think is still in pretty strong competition with Python from the perspective of we collaborate a lot with like mathematicians and statisticians, and R is their usual favorite, just because statistics, like all the best statistical packages, are still pretty much in R, and so that's where a lot of people live. ggplot's pretty good, plots.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's really focused, and it's really good at what it does. And one of the things that I think's worth just considering it, if somebody comes, let's say brand new first year grad student comes into the lab, and you're like, all right, what's your programming experience? Like, well, programmed the clock on the VCR. Like, okay, we're gonna have to start you somewhere or something, right? And you could teach them something really specific like MATLAB or something along those lines. But if they learn something like Julia, not like Julia, like Python, not Julia, maybe even not really R, but R is closer somewhat, is they learn not just a skill for the lab, but it's kind of almost any software job is potentially within reach with a little bit of, you know, learning
Exactly.
about that area, right? Like if you know Python, you say, I want a job, there's a massive set of options out there. If you say,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
know MATLAB or even Julia, it's like, okay, well, here's the few labs and the few research areas and the real. I just think it's something
A lot of
that
engineering firms.
yeah. I'm just thinking that like a lot of academic folks should consider what happens if the student doesn't necessarily become a professor. You know what I mean? Which is actually is a lot of the time, right? Or a
Oh,
professional
yeah.
researcher of some sort. And that's a really awesome skill to have on top of your degree. So I think that's just a big win for it. That I'm happy to see that.
Yeah, and that literal situation just happened where a statistician that we were collaborating pretty closely with graduated, brilliant guy, and got a job at Microsoft. And so we were in a meeting after he was there, and they were like, "What's some advice that you have now that you've been, in industry for a while?" And he's like, "Stop using R, learn Python, because everyone here uses Python." And it took me a few months to kind of switch from the R worldview of caret hyphen or to equal sign to actually to work and collaborate with everyone, because everyone's just using Python.
Yeah, very
From its
interesting.
perspective, and I'm sure it's not unique.
No, I'm sure that it's not either. I think, yeah, I just think it's not like a religious war. It's not like, oh, I think Python is absolutely better. You should just not use other stuff. I just think it's preparing people for stuff beyond school. It's a pretty interesting angle to take.
Yeah, and it's not like you
Yeah.
can't learn other things. I think it's really good to learn other languages, especially
It's-
ones that
yeah.
are complementary, where R can be complementary, especially now that they have a lot of the subsystem packages. Or when I get R code, I usually just write like a sub process. I did this recently, just wrote like a sub process line to call the R script because I was too lazy to rewrite it.
Sure.
The thing. But there's other, like, I don't know, like Rust is probably a good one to probably try and branch out, or like lower level languages like C++.
Yeah.
If you need them for what you're doing.
Yeah, and it sounds like you guys do for talking to hardware and stuff like that.
Yeah, occasionally. Boy, there's not a lot of things Python can't do.
Yeah, for sure.
There's really
MicroPython. Yeah, break out some MicroPython when you got to get your microcontrollers and stuff. So another thing that's, I don't know how it's received. I know it took a while to kind of really catch on. And I think the thing that just broke the final barriers for open source being adopted, at least in business, was the AI stuff and the data science stuff. People are like, "Oh, we can't use this open source stuff. We got to have a SLA and some company we can sue if our code doesn't work right, or whatever, right? Something crazy like that." And they're like, "But you understand all the AI and all the data science. We have to use this open source stuff." Like, all right, fine. What's the open source story for you guys?
Yeah, so I mean, academia is probably championed open source for a really long time, just because, I mean, open source even when I first started, was just if you read a paper and someone has some new fancy analysis, before it became a bigger push by like funding agencies to like actually post it to GitHub or some repository. I mean, you could just email people and be like, "Hey, I saw your paper. I want that script," and they would just send you a MATLAB file, and it would be just whatever they had written, but it was in MATLAB, and you'd have to kind of tear it apart yourself, and there's little to no documentation. You'd be lucky if there's comments, and it's spaghetti code, but you figure that out, and you kind of work backwards and deconstruct it, and eventually you kind of have their code. So that kind of ethos of just scientists are really good by and large of just sharing information and helping people out. If you have a question, just ask, has kind of always been there. At least in our field, it's not as competitive as some other ones where you're just kind of like racing to get the next project out. It happens, but rarely. But now a lot of funding agencies and just in general, people are just excited about, when you publish a paper, you put a GitHub link in the bottom of the paper, and then that links to the repository. And maybe it's not been updated in a while, but the code's there, and you can just take it. grab it.
For the reproducibility. How about using other things? Like, is there, there's SciPy. I know for astronomy, there's AstroPy. Is there a NeuroPy? Something?
They're starting to be. So it's really still more analysis dependent and pre-process dependent. So there's kind of this, it's still the early days where there's probably too many formats just because no one can agree on what's the best one. So like even a lot of the data formats are written kind of in Python to take whatever data you have and reformat it to something shareable. There's 5 or 6 of them floating around. There's probably 2 that are still duking it out to see which one will be the best, and probably 5 years from now there's going to be a better one. So data formats, certainly there's kind of this, there's a few that are neck and neck. Analysis pipelines, a lot of those are still done in-house, but there's starting to be a lot more toolkits and frameworks and packages. There's some really good ones that have more documentation written. They're on the PyPy repositories, so you can just pip install them and you have them. The computational neuroscience people are great at this. So all the like neural simulation software, that is all really well documented, really well written. A lot of good like example code and tutorials and so on. So yeah, we're starting to see kind of this more robust kind of ecosystem where you can just kind of pull things. It still just kind of varies. There's probably still not one go-to place other than the standard data science toolkit. So
right.
If you're using
the
Python,
pandas and so on.
NumPy. NumPy, Matplotlib, Pandas, scikit-learn. If you're doing deep learning, PyTorch or TensorFlow. All of those still apply to any data science stack.
Yeah, of course. What's your day-to-day stack look like if you're sitting down to do some analysis?
Yeah, so like I said, the standard, I have a VS Code kind of like autocomplete where I just write import in, and it just NumPy, Matplotlib, Pandas. Then I usually delete Pandas because unless I have a CSV file, I'm not using it. So NumPy and Matplotlib, I can probably do 75% of the things I want to do. Scikit-learn and SciPy, obviously, if I'm doing any stats with those things, those libraries are my go-to. And then over the last few years, I kind of just have my own, just because you catch yourself writing the same functions over and over and over again. And so just started building my kind of internal framework of just things I know I need. So if I'm working with LFP data, I have all my filters there. If I have spike data, I have all my spikes there. We do a lot of decoding, so developing like deep learning algorithms to decode neural data. All of those are kind of listed there. So yeah, and I started to understand my friends that work in Silicon Valley when they're like, oh, I'm on internal tools team, and they don't talk about it like they're.
But you don't make anything? Come on, man.
Yeah, and then like I started realizing like, dude, internal tools make the difference between like solving a problem in 10 minutes or solving it in an hour, where I can just like sit down and have everything automated to come up. So yeah, the standard data science stack I use pretty frequently. Hardware stack, so VS Code I just recently switched to, just because everyone was talking about it from like Sublime, or I usually just edit it in a terminal. And I was like, I'll try it out. Everyone's talking about it. And it's one of the good things Microsoft has done. It's pretty sweet.
Yeah, it is pretty sweet.
So that's pretty nice.
Okay. And when you're doing the VS Code stuff, are you just writing straight Python scripts, or are you doing like VS Code on top of notebooks?
Yeah, so Jupyter's
it has great. Like that kind of like text view of a notebook type of thing, I think.
Yeah, I used to use exclusively Python scripts, so just the .py, and then started seeing how great Jupyter was. And so then you start doing everything in Jupyter, and then you start to have all these like convoluted notebooks and like notebook V1 through 7. So then you realize that you got to like find a balance between like, notebooks are great for presentation and for like quickly testing, but the sooner you can get it into like a class structure or a package or something.
Sort of productized version of it, you wanted to get it down into Python code a lot of times, probably.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, you're like, all right,
So,
like your internal tools
usually,
you talked about. You're like, all right, this is the library you just call stuff, right? That just belongs more as a package and not a
exactly. Yeah. So the sooner you can kind of pull the code out of the notebook and just leave notebooks for presentation, is probably the best.
yeah.
It's a lot of pipelines, so it's a lot of pre-processing pipelines. So you don't want 50 cells of just moving data around.
Preparing, yeah.
Yeah.
So you talked about having quite a bit of data, some of that being image based. Sounds like a lot of work. Do you have like a big compute cluster? Do you just have like an M3 Ultra or whatever? That's not even out yet. It's the M2s. But do you have just a big machine, or do you guys do cloud stuff? What's compute look like?
Yeah, so it depends on what I'm doing, what I need. Most things, let's be honest, I could probably just use MacBook, or I have my own my desktop computer is really a Supermicro server. Just runs Linux. But then like if we're doing deep learning, you need GPUs, and so we have a nice set of GPUs we can pull to.
Okay. Yeah. Do you do your own training on LLMs and other deep learning things?
Yeah. The only LLM
not
training
just
I do
consumers.
is just for fun, but
yeah.
So all the deep learning stuff we have to train kind of in house on our particular data. So that's pull GPUs for that. A lot of the statistics we do are like permutations, so you need to kind of like parallelize them out into CPUs. So then I'll pull like a CPU cluster we have if I need it. But also I realized too.
Sorry, does UC Irvine have like a big compute resource?
They have a few.
Sort of thing you can grab?
They have a campus-wide one that you can get on, and there's a few independent ones that I have access to. So GPU is kind of in a different place than CPUs are, so I can just kind of pick and choose. And then I have a few servers in the lab that I've just kind of put together that all my camera stuff, all my behavior, I kind of wrote it so it's cloud-based, so I can kind of just pull up my phone and look at the videos of what animals are doing and stuff. All that runs on just a server in the lab. So yeah, it's the compute is there when you need it, and I think as I've matured, I've kind of learned, when to use what compute when, and when it's worth taking the extra time to use it when, you don't need to, and also when a lot of the times you don't even need it. So I know a lot of people when I see their code and they complain that it takes like an hour to run. I mean, just using multiprocessing in Python, that in and of itself is enough to not need to use a cluster.
Right.
They're just using a single thread for their analysis.
Right, for sure. Or just a bad programming patterns, design patterns, like you're looping over the thing in the pandas data frame instead of doing vector operations in the pandas data frame, like that kind of stuff, right?
100%. Yeah. I mean, that was one of the first things that I usually teach. I have this little example script that shows that, like, why is it better to pre-allocate array rather than to just, append to the bottom? And it's like these things that we kind of take for granted now, but, it's not intuitive unless you actually
you learn it the hard way, but it sticks in your mind once you learn it.
Yeah.
Well, so how do you go about?
That's the issue. It's like people just take it for granted.
Yeah, for sure. Like, why didn't you know that? How do you onboard new people? If you get new grad students or people other contributors.
Yeah, it just kind of depends on the lab. Every lab kind of has their own structure of just kind of this hierarchy of expertise where like I started as an undergrad and I just volunteered in a lab at a different university and just volunteered my time, eventually could get paid, just wanted to spend time in the lab, and you could, all the way up to grad students who are there to get a PhD and have more kind of autonomy over their projects, a postdoc who has a PhD and 5 to 8 years of experience, and so can pretty work well. Then there's like staff scientists, or even a lot of labs now are hiring just pure engineers or pure software people. Who need to, because there's such a need for that. And so, yeah, it really just depends on the lab specific situation and what their focus is on and what they need and those sorts of things.
Cool. Yeah, I guess if you have a good NSF grant and you got some extra money, it might be money well spent to hire some student who has good programming skills, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. One sec.
No worries.
All right. Let's see. You talked about the video stuff that you're doing, the streaming video. Like, do you actually do analysis on that, or is it just for you to go back and look at?
Oh yeah. We do analysis on that. There's actually a pretty cool deep learning package out now. We didn't write it. Another lab did, where you just give it the video frame and it can automatically segment kind of if it's an animal, right? So like where their paws are or where their like nose is looking, or in some cases people have like, you're talking about eye tracking. They do eye tracking in like mice now.
They do eye tracking on mice? That was hard on humans in the 90s.
Yeah, there's a lot of VR. So they put kind of mice in this like VR system.
Oh, wow.
And then they can like see where their little mouse pupil is looking on like the VR screen.
Yeah. And do they show them different scenarios and they can detect that and they react to it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Incredible.
So yeah, and a lot of stuff, at least in our field, the Nobel Prize was awarded for, you stick some electrodes in the hippocampus part of your brain that's important for learning and memory. Then you have the animal kind of run around some environment. And then you take some video data of kind of where they were running the environment. And if you were only looking at the brain data, you can predict to like 90% accuracy the location of the animal. So you can show there's kind of this correspondence that inside the brain is a map of kind of the environment. Our stuff, we're taking that a little one step further that says this map is not just for space, it's for non-spatial and other things too. That there's this kind of network of information in the brain that the animal can kind of like navigate through, even if they're just standing still but thinking about some sort of problem. But we use video data to, validate what the animal's doing, or check what kind of tasks they're doing, and so on and so forth.
Wow.
So yeah, a lot of multimodal heterogeneous data that each needs its own funky pre-processing, and depending on the task at hand, you're writing something new to ask that question.
Amazing. So is that OpenCV?
My stuff is, yeah. My
Nice.
stuff is OpenCV and streamed over sockets and some Django web page. It's fun. It's cool to build.
Yeah, that sounds really cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what kind of questions are you answering with the video?
Yeah.
Or is it just to correlate back with the time series of what you're measuring in the brain?
Yeah, so one thing I'm looking at is, so like I said, the Nobel Prize was for the spatial map. We're doing this non-spatial stuff. And so we kind of do both in the lab, where we have an animal kind of run around, and then we have an animal just kind of sit still and do some sort of mental task. In our case, they have to memorize a sequence of odors, and if the sequence gets shuffled, they make a different choice. And so we're basically showing how does the brain work for the spatial part versus the non-spatial part? What's similar about these two things? What's different about these things? And we show that one of our recent papers was that the brain uses a lot of the similar mechanisms to navigate space as it does to navigate this kind of non-spatial odor task. But we also showed that there's this mechanism that the brain uses to take kind of discrete memories and link them together into some coherent whole. Best case being like this talk, we've been talking back and forth for 30 some minutes now. And inside there's kind of chunks of the conversation. So if tomorrow someone was to ask you, what did you and that neuroscience guy talk about on your podcast, you would kind of rattle off this story of, we talked about history of Python and this and this and this, right? This, and this are each kind of discrete memories that in your brain you kind of lock together.
Right.
So that you could use them, make decisions about them, and so on and so forth.
Think about it
so
as a whole, not just the little ideas. every little idea, but like just the big concept of it, right?
Exactly, yeah. And it's a fundamental thing that the brain does. Like people say humans are storytellers, and your life is kind of the sequence of events of stories. And so you use that every single day. And across a bunch of diseases, that's one of the first things to actually be impaired, whether it's addiction or schizophrenia or Alzheimer's. That kind of ability to link things in time and link them well and make decisions about them starts to get impaired.
Yeah, and that's not great when that happens, but that is what happens, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess what are some of the software engineering practices, for lack of a better word, that you would recommend that maybe other grad students, professors who are feeling like they don't have their software game fully together, pay attention to it? And maybe what should they ignore, right? Like, should they pay attention to like source control and GitHub? Should they have unit tests, or what should they pay attention to? Not.
First off, no one writes tests. That is just only the very few, very well put together, and usually people who just came from industry write tests.
Sure,
which is an issue. But yeah, first off, just learn Python. I've said that hundreds of times, and I'm preaching to the choir in this audience. But
you are for sure.
Learn Python. It's honestly, there's not much better you could learn now. And two, it's quintessential automation stuff. So it's really just think about the things that you're doing, like the spreadsheets or the simple things, and really just ask yourself, if you find yourself doing any repetitive tasks, that's a software problem. And those are the things to kind of look at first. And so you have your text editor in one window, Google in the other, and Stack Overflow your way to learning. And so the way people, I think, really do kind of teach themselves Python is probably the best way to learn. But nevertheless, I think there is a real need for, and again, we're starting to see more of it, just formal education, even if it's just a course. Our program is really great that they started to teach a Python course just because the students requested it, because they knew,
interesting.
How important it was.
Like a Python for neuroscience.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what it is. Yeah. I mean, you just work your way through if statements, for loops, data types.
But you probably also, I'm just guessing, you get a chance to work with some of these external libraries that are relevant to studies they're doing, right? Exactly. Rather than here's an example of stock market data. You're like, great, I'm not a trader. I don't want to be a programmer. Why am I here?
Yeah, it's really relevant. And I think it's just kind of seeing like, oh yeah, I would do that, this way, but this is so much easier if I use Python. And I can use it in Python, and just seeing that, oh, it's not as bad as the mountain looks a lot higher when you're at the base than the summit. So
it does.
Just kind of, seeing it done once is usually enough to kind of tell people it's not as bad as you originally think.
Yeah, I feel like maybe I saw it this way. I certainly know a lot of other people see it this way. I mean, when I was younger, but a lot of people see it this way as well. Is that like you got to be crazy smart to do programming? It's really challenging. It's kind of one of those things that only few people can do. And then you get into it, and you're like, oh, it's not a few really huge steps and things you got to solve. It's like 1,000 small steps. And each one of the little small steps, you're like, that was actually easy. That's no big deal. What's the next step? And you get to the end, you're like, where was the big step? Where was it really hard, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have some experience where like people in the department or people that worked with you are like, I'm not a programmer, I don't want to do this stuff. And then they kind of got into it and really found out that programming was something they really liked. Any converts out there?
Yeah, I would say so. I think so. I think it's, I think there's kind of two kinds of people. There's people who program just because, what is it? The programming is an art book or whatever. Like they love it just for the sake of like loving it, right? And I'm probably closer to those kind of people, right? Like I just think it's the coolest thing, like academically. But then there's the people who just kind of see it as like it's a tool like anything else. And so like you could be an expert in a drill, or you could just know to pick up a drill. And I think that's kind of the majority of people, is that it's just another tool in their toolkit to, especially for a scientist, just to answer the question that you're trying to answer. And I would even flip the reverse, where there's been some times where I've maybe even used Python too much, in the sense that like I made a problem more, because it's like the automation dilemma, right? It's like, do I spend an hour automating this when I could do it in 10 minutes, And so
but if you got to do it a lot of times, then all of a sudden the hour is worth it. But if it turns out
it's like I might need this a year from now, so I might as well just write the script, whereas I could just do it in Excel or something.
That's pretty standard problems we all run into in programming. It's like, I'll write some code to do that, or I could just be done with it, for sure. All right, I think we got time for a couple more topics. One thing that I think might be fun to talk about is publishing papers, right? Obviously, if you're in academics, especially in labs, you got to publish papers. Do you use notebooks and stuff like that for your papers, or is that just kind of separate?
Like I said, notebooks are great for presentation. I use notebooks kind of for development, just because you can quickly run code and go back up and move things around. And so I kind of like that ability to kind of just, a stream of consciousness write code until you kind of like see how it's kind of working, the prototype, and then refactor out into an actual .py document or a package or something else. So that's kind of been my workflow, and it works pretty well. But then when you actually, have the code and it works and it's robust, you actually want to put, there's a lot of figures. That's usually the main thing. So you kind of put all of that, here's the data, here's the pre-processing, here's the figure 1, here's figure 2, figure 3 in the notebook, just so it's reproducible and other people can download it and rerun your code and that sort of thing. So I think that's slowly becoming kind of the standard approach for those labs that use Python and they share their code openly. That's kind of how they do it.
Anything like executable books or any of those things that kind of produce printable output out of the notebooks, like publishable output out of the notebooks?
Yeah, so not a lot, but there's one of the journals is called eLife. It's kind of it's trying to like push the boundaries of what it means to publish a scientific paper, and so they kind of have because most papers are really just on the web. Nowadays, the journals aren't really physical journals as much anymore. They kind of have like papers as executable code where you can like plot the figure in the browser and kind of run through the notebook, and just as an experiment. But it's pretty cool to kind of see these like new alternative ways to still convey the same findings, but you can play with it. You can kind of see how that thing goes. So the methods are kind of implicit in the output.
What's the name of the journal?
That's eLife. Yeah.
eLife. Okay. Cool. Yeah, you'd probably, I suppose, need some way to capture the data output, because you might not have access to the compute to recompute it on, somehow it's got to sort of be a static version, but that sounds really cool.
Yeah, and especially for like most recently some of our like trained models, it's becoming more important to just share the weights and share those sorts of things too. You can't just share the code to train the thing if people don't have the compute to actually train them themselves. So it's kind of growing to not just sharing your data, not just sharing your code, but you need to share like the key derivatives of the pre-processing and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Or even just sharing the version numbers, because there's been the psychology or fMRI literature, there's like a bug in some version that like made a lot of the results null. And so, one person could use version 3.7 of a package, but that had a bug, but people don't know that.
Right. So they claim it's not reproducible, but it's really just not the same algorithms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or like across languages, like if you rerun the same analysis in MATLAB versus Python versus R, especially complex ones, there's a lot of little design decisions under the hood that might tweak, exactly how that regression fits, or exactly how that, if you're statistically sampling, how the sampling works under the hood of those sorts of things.
Awesome. Are you familiar with the Journal of Open Source Software?
Yeah.
I had the folks on for there. Yeah, I had them on quite a while ago, and I think they're trying to solve an interesting problem of, if you take the time to create a really nice package for your area, you might have not taken your time writing the paper, and so you wouldn't get credit because you don't have as many papers to publish. So they let you publish like your open source work there, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah,
what do you think about that?
Yeah, we kind of had that same problem. One of I run a nonprofit called Continual AI. It does artificial intelligence kind of outreach and research, and we have conferences and all sorts of events. But one of the main things we've done is we built a deep learning library on top of PyTorch called Avalanche. And so like we had a really great community of mostly volunteers who just saw the need in the field and put it together. But then again, it's like a lot of us are academics. How do you present this? And so you write wrapper papers around kind of the framework. So that's kind of been the de facto way of like, it's not really a paper, but you still need to like, share it and get credit for it and put your name on it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's certainly an issue, and I'm starting to see it not even just with software, but even with hardware, because hardware is becoming more open source in our field. And so you just kind of write like a paper about the hardware solution to some problem.
That's cool.
It's better than a patent.
Yeah, it's definitely better than a patent. Patents, while they serve a purpose, are pretty evil. Let's wrap things up with maybe just you mentioned Continual AI. Tell people a bit about that.
Yeah, so it's the largest nonprofit for continual learning. Continual learning in a nutshell is, say I have a neural network, and I train my neural network to classify cats. And I classify cats to 90% accuracy, and we're like, yeah, this is why neural networks are great. I take that same trained neural network on cats and I train it on, say, dogs. It does really well, 90% accuracy on dogs. We're really excited why neural networks are so great. But the issue is if I take that, again, the same network, I just trained it on dogs, I previously trained it on cats, I try and test it on cats again, it's going to forget pretty much everything it learned about cats. And this is an old problem back in like, the good old days of when neural networks were connectionist models, and it was computer scientist, it was the cognitive scientist.
It's like they noticed overtraining or something like that, right? Kind of overfitting to the dog.
They're all related. Yeah, it's very similar. Catastrophic forgetting, they call it the sequential learning problem, which is why I'm really interested in it, because I'm really interested in continual learning and sequential memory. Or in neuroscience, it's called the stability plasticity problem. So when do you learn? When do you remember? And so over since we started the organization in 2018, the field has kind of exploded just because there's such a need for overcoming this across a lot of use cases. So like a lot of times you can only see the data once. So the way you solve the problem generally is you just shuffle in cats and dogs into the same data set and retrain your model. But now the neural networks are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Retraining is getting costlier and costlier. You can't just have, you can't train a network on petabytes every time you want to update it. That's even if you have access to the data and the storage to save it and so on and so forth. So clever ways to solve the problem. And so we're kind of around that. We have neuroscientists, we have computer scientists, AI researchers across academia, industry, all that are just a bunch of people really interested in this problem to just come together and share papers, share ideas. We just had a conference. We sponsor a lot of competitions for people to kind of put forward an idea to some problem that we kind of put out every year. So it's been really, really exciting to kind of see the community grow over the years and all the tools and fun things that's kind of come out of it.
Well, it's definitely a hot topic right now. You know,
Absolutely.
I know the cognitive scientists and neuroscientists studied neural networks and stuff, and it was kind of like, well, maybe this model stuff. And then now we're in the time of LLMs, and the world has gone crazy.
Absolutely.
So I guess I said we were going to close out with a continual AI, but let me just ask, what are your thoughts on LLMs, where the stuff's going? I mean, we all have exposure to it in different
Yeah.
ways, but you've got this understanding of what they're trying to model it on quite a bit. So, what do you guys in your space think of it?
So, and I was, so the first lab I joined was well, the first real lab I joined was a neuroscience lab where we were sticking wires in brains and actually doing real neuroscience. But I also started kind of simultaneously working with a cognitive scientist where we were working on the original Word2Vec. So this is, in my mind, like the grandfather of the LLM. So this is the model that like overnight took Google Translate from being meh to pretty good. It's just really at the heart of it, just an autoencoder. But we were really excited then doing kind of semantic modeling of just how much further kind of deep learning could take language modeling. And then we were actually using it to study catastrophic forgetting. So does Word2Vec catastrophically forget? And the punchline is it does. And that kind of got me jumped into really excited about continual learning and so on. So I saw kind of that trajectory then, and then kind of stepped out of it for a few years and dug more deep into, pure neuroscience and artificial intelligence from other angles. But I had always been just so fascinated by this idea of like, say you take an AI and it could read every book or it could read the internet, like what would you be able to get? And that was kind of, in my mind, like, well, seeing Word2Vec try and do the same thing and training it on my laptop, like, well, it's going to take a minute till we get there. And I underestimated that drastically.
It was like almost no progress. Wow, what just happened? Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and I think
crazy.
It's a testament to statistical learning more than anything, which is just how much information can you just soak up and put together in a fancy new way and regurgitate back. I think the next big leap is going to be adding more cognition to that progress. So when an agent has a goal, when an agent kind of has to break down a series of steps to get to that goal, those kinds of things we don't see as much of. And that will kind of be the next big push, I think, that'll kind of take all the cool things that LLMs can do now and kind of blow everyone away of just, if you could take the internet and put it on a 7 gigabyte file, what can that get you? But what if you could take the internet, put it on a 7 gigabyte file, but actually have some sort of logic and direction, and the agent itself can actually navigate through its own thoughts? That's going to take us, I think, right to the borderline of
Terminator.
Yeah,
not Terminator. I'm just kidding.
It won't be Terminator. No, it won't be Terminator. But it'll be really an intelligent system.
Yeah. It's going to be super interesting. You've got all this prompt engineering and these clever ways to kind of get the current LLMs in the right mindset, which is probably a personification, but you can tell it things like, here, I want you to tell me how to do this, and it'll come up with some answer. You can say, I want you to think step by step, and then all of a sudden you get a real different type of answer where it pulls out the pieces and it thinks about how it does it. And I think it's going to be interesting. It's kind of like, it feels like kind of that kind of stuff, but it already knows how to think. You don't have to give it little weird clues like, you're an expert in this and you're really good at it. Now I want to ask you a question about it. Oh, I'm good at it. Okay, I'll answer better,
Yeah. I don't know. My favorite definition of AI is it's whatever computers can't do yet.
Yeah.
Because 30 years ago, if we had this conversation, it'd be like, so what do you think of Deep Blue? Do you think Deep Blue, the AI that beat Kasparov at chess, can think, and is it going to take all our jobs? Or it's going to be, what can Watson do? Can it think and take all our jobs? And, that was solved with tree search, which, undergraduates in their second year CS class are learning. It's just a standard. It's search. People don't even think of search as AI.
What if we just loaded every possible outcome into the chess thing and the steps, and we just try to take, traverse each step and see where it takes us, right?
Exactly. So, there's always going to be a room to grow, but, from a cognitive science perspective, I think something far more interesting I think it's cool to see what computers can actually do. And I think they can do a hell of a lot more, but I think it's more interesting to kind of ask the more philosophical question of what does that actually mean for us? Because at every step of the way, when we develop something new in artificial intelligence, it tells us something a lot deeper about our own intelligence too. Yeah. Where back in the 50s and 60s, they thought that chess meant intelligence. And so now we're kind of seeing with LLMs, if someone just reads a bunch of books and can memorize a bunch of books, does that mean they're intelligent? Because that's effectively what an LLM can do.
It can read. It comes across as intelligent, right? It comes across that way to people like, oh, you have all the answers, but it doesn't mean you were good at problem solving necessarily.
Exactly. And so I think we're kind of peeling at this onion, and we're kind of segmenting intelligence into its different categories to really kind of break it apart, and just from this vague word of intelligence into actually what are the parts that make something intelligent? What does it really mean? And what are still the things that like we thought were hard and are really easy, or the things that we thought were easy and really hard? Because any LLM you have now can't chew gum and walk to the store and buy you something to eat and then play you in chess. And so the general AI isn't just there for, to make it sound grander. It's there because that's actually something that makes humans very, very unique, is that I can have this conversation with you, write code, prepare an omelet, walk a dog, and do all of these things all at once. And I started as a baby.
And have feelings and thoughts and introspection about it and all that.
Hopes, dreams, like ketchup and not tomatoes, and all sorts of other things.
Yeah, super interesting. So are you pretty positive on where stuff's going?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I'm less concerned about the AI itself, and I'm more concerned about just how we react to it. And if we react intelligent, we react well. We went through the Industrial Revolution. We went through the Steel Age. We're starting to go through the cognitive revolution, or whatever people are going to call this 100 years ago. I think by and large, people are going to be okay. I think we just need to, have good policies, make sure that people do it responsibly, people do it well. And that's going to be the hard part, is just how do we manage the transition well? How do we take a whole labor force whose jobs will be gone? Like there's no economic incentive to keep their jobs, and retrain them in a really smart and sensible way. So people's livelihoods don't just go away to maximize the dollar. Those are kind of problems that are going to need good policy and clever solutions and a lot of research to actually sit down and handle well. But AI isn't going to go anywhere, just like computers haven't went anywhere. But it's not Terminator that we should worry about.
No, absolutely. It's certainly not. I was joking. We should worry about disinformation and politics and news.
And I think, I don't know. I think people get so hung up on all the negatives that we kind of forget, like, we're developing these tools for a reason. Like, scientists are spending so much time, and we're excited about them for a reason. One being that I used to work on proteins, trying to find the structure of proteins. And that was one protein a year. It would take 1 year to find the structure of protein. And now I can run this. I took the same sequence that we found and ran it through AlphaFold, which is DeepMind's protein folding software. And it could do it in 5 minutes. Those are the things that'll really like catalyze science and technology and healthcare, and actually solve the problems we want to solve. So that's
find new energy sources. I think I heard even some AI stuff coming up with some new battery chemistry potentially, and things
everything.
Like that.
How do you appropriately kind of harness like a fusion ring and like a tokamak reactor or something like that? Everything, even to how do you route a a PCB with like millions of traces effectively. So it's a tool for the mind, and it's not going to put our minds out of work, like you said a long time ago when you were in your eye tracking lab.
Yeah,
You're not
exactly. It's like
automating
a
their
different
jobs
view
away.
of that thing. Yeah, exactly.
The same reason that none of us want to sit around and churn butter and go till the fields and walk to work.
Yeah. I don't dislike my clothes washer. Not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for giving us a look inside your lab, inside your research and the field,
Absolutely.
and then just, sharing what you've been up to. It's been great.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been really great to at least for the years that I've been in research, seeing how pivotal Python has been. And I think that's one of the big things that probably goes unnoticed by a lot of developers when they're actually writing their code to solve whatever problem they're solving, is that, I mean, someone who's wrote the NumPy library or the scikit-learn library or Jupyter Notebooks has actively played a part in curing diseases and making people's lives better. And those stories usually don't kind of come to the forefront.
Yeah, it's not a direct line, right? But the research was done and facilitated by these open source tools, and then discoveries were made.
But like we said, that's the difference between people getting cured in 10 years or getting cured in a year, and that's thousands of lives. And so you might not think about it when you're sitting behind your desk, making something usable. But for every day a PhD student doesn't have to like pull their hair out and debug some software when it's well written and it works well, that's a day that they can, find something new.
That's awesome. So, yeah. Very inspiring. Let's leave it there, Keelan. Thank you for being on the show. Yeah, it's been great to talk to you. Thanks for coming. Yeah, thanks for coming.